movement has become more noticeable, and a number of ponds are women only, are women's cooperatives who are amongst the most productive and profitable. You want to try here of the ponds. The non-governmental individual has expanded massively and become totally useless. So he has now got 80 staff, and he's taking the corporate chili. India passed this law that every large corporation has to give 2% of its profits for corporate social responsibility. And that has led to an avalanche of toilet building around India, right? Because corporates love toilets, they can stick their logos on them, you know, it's tangible, it's kind of results agenda gone mad. So the guy at VCAL suddenly saw a load of money for doing toilets, so his entire raison d'etre has become toilet building now. And people keep chickens in them and occasionally using them as toilets, but they're really it's a rather few places often. But the fishing community say, it's fine. They were pleased to see him again, and been there for years. He said, actually, we're okay now. We're totally organised. We've graduated. We don't need that interceding role anymore. We just go and talk to the politicians. We have enough votes. So we can actually influence politics. We think. Not all the news was good. Climate change has got worse in that part of India. They're suffering severe droughts. Not many of the ponds were actually functioning when I was there. There's now a big dispute over who gets to farm the pond beds when they become exposed by drought, and the rich guys will come back in to fight over that one. So there's another battle now over that. But it was a fascinating process, sort of example of some of the change processes that were tried to put together in the book. I'll now do a little bit about the book. So it's not a new topic. Heraclitus, 6th century BC. Everything changes, nothing stays the same. Karl Marx, a very famous quote from Marx. The philosophers spend too much time thinking about the world, they need to change it. My experience is completely the opposite. In Oxfam, everybody spends their entire time trying to change the world, and no one ever thinks about it. So the role of the book is to try and go back towards that position of being both activists and reflectivists. I think there's real weaknesses when people are so hung up on action that they don't spend time reading, thinking, or looking around. And I'll talk a bit about that. The audience is another development phrase. There is no right word for the audience for the book. So change agents is as good as it gets. Not just campaigners. I've worked with supermarkets, garment companies, banks, governments, local governments, and a lot of the challenges and the ways of thinking that face anyone trying to create change in those institutions are remarkably similar. So the book is aimed at people who are trying to bring about change wherever they are, hence the James Bond. The main sections, I got very, very interested in something which had previously seemed very waffly, systems thinking, and how we understand power. So the first section, and I'll talk about that now, is about that. Then I looked at the actual institutions which change agents are trying to influence. Large corporations, states, political parties, the legal system, and the international system. I looked at change actors, civil activists, but also leaders. Where do those, what made those 3 or 4 guys in Deacon Garden stand out? What is it that makes people lead? What is the backdrop to this extraordinary surge of women's grassroots leadership we've seen over the last 20 years around the world? And then leads at the top, I followed an MP round in Papua New Guinea for a week, which was also an extraordinary experience. So, an advocacy, which is a kind of formalised way of trying to influence public policy and other policies which NGOs and other people are looking for. And then the bit which is missing from most of these books on development is the Monday morning question. Normally you have a fantastic explanation of why what everybody else has said is wrong, why nothing works, and then the book just kind of stops. And it's very frustrating. So what I've spent quite a lot of time talking to people about is, so what do we do differently because of this? So I'm going to talk about the first bit and the last bit, and you just have to trust me that when the books arrive, all that important bit in the middle is actually there. I haven't got time to do it. The cake. Okay? Let's start with a cake. To make a cake, You need a recipe. Well, I need a recipe. Some people do better cooks than me. But I need a recipe, I need ingredients, I need an oven. If I follow the recipe and I have the ingredients and the oven works, whoever I am, wherever in the world I am, whenever in history I am, I will be able to produce a cake. It's a linear process where if you follow the instructions, you can pretty well predict what you get, and if the cake is nice, you can say that person followed the recipe. This is the project. Okay? This is the ultimate artifact of aid, development, and activism. We think in terms of projects to such an extent that it's almost impossible to think in any other way. If you say to people in the aid business, imagine there's no projects, what would you do? They have a sort of brain explosion. And it's kind of, what do I do? And yet they're historically specific. They came out of the Second World War, infrastructure, water, roads, bridges, but they then expanded, the project format expanded into everything. So if you want to work on sexuality, child rights, malnutrition, you need a project. People come up to me around the world when I'm traveling and say, can I show you my project? And it's just an experience that you have in the aid business that you can just talk and compare endlessly projects, which is fine. You know, if you're trying to, if someone's building a bridge, I quite like them to have a plan. You know, that's not a bad thing. But in many of the things we're talking about in terms of social and political change, the system we're trying to influence looks like this. This is a US military power plant. And it's a stakeholder mapping. Even soldiers have to go through this torment, right? A stakeholder mapping of Afghanistan. And it was leaked, and everybody laughed at it, and I looked at it and I thought, that's amazingly good. Someone has really made an effort to understand who talks to who, and who influences who in Afghanistan. And the point about this, and the guy who drew it up was sacked by General Petraeus as soon as he saw this PowerPoint slide. So soldiers don't necessarily like to get the complexity. But it is a complex system. And the nature of a complex system is it is different from a complicated system. A complex system has so many connections and feedback loops that it is essentially unknowable. If you intervene in that system with $100 million of aid or 10,000 US Marines, effects will ripple through the system, and you will not be able to predict in advance what will eventually happen. There are just too many variables. No computer's going to help you. No PhD's going to help you. It's a many-body problem. And if that system changes, you can never be 100% sure why. You can't attribute that change completely to one or other cause. Which is kind of obvious. You know that this is how life is. Unfortunately, we've been brought up to deal with this system with cakes. And I think this is the underlying cognitive dissonance which causes so much pain and suffering in the aid and development business. When confronted with a system like that, if your tool is a cake, if your tool is a linear process, a logical framework, a project plan, you look for bits of linearity. You look for things which are pretty linear. You think, well, if I vaccinate 100 kids, those kids are not going to get sick. And that works for a while until something goes wrong, until the CIA decide to use a doctor to fund Osama bin Laden and everything goes pear-shaped. But you do that, or, and there's some great work by Ros Eichen at IDS on this, you just learn to lie. So she's done fantastic sort of ethnography of aid workers around the world, and how they're not stupid, they know that life is like this, and they ride, they surf the tides, and they adjust and adapt to what things as they change. But then when they report to HQ, they turn it all into a cake. And they do their nice project plan, and they say, yes, we knew this was going to happen all along, look at our peak performance indicators, aren't we great? And they have to ride these two horses. Now that's an interesting skill, but it's not a terribly productive one. It actually wastes a huge amount of effort in terms of pointing in two directions. The key things that change in these complex systems pose some really interesting challenges to activists, to change agents. One is that change is smooth sometimes, but often it's spiky. There are these things which political scientists call critical junctures, where you have an earthquake. Pressures build up over time, and suddenly there's an earthquake, and the earthquake can be an earthquake. natural disaster. It can be political. It can be Robert Mugabe dying in Zimbabwe. It can be an economic meltdown. It can be the 2008 financial crisis. There are lots of these different critical junctures. And the point about them is that they are hugely important in terms of change. When these critical junctures hit, things are thrown up in the air, which sort of existing relationships and power relationships are thrown up in the air, and they can get worse or they can get better. So if you're interested in change, you need to understand the role of critical junctures and how you can actually use them for good or prevent the bad stuff happening. So there's a lot to be done, I think, because we still basically have a continuous model of change underlying a lot of our planning and thinking, which doesn't help us when we go on to critical junctures. Path dependence, one thing leads to another. The reason why Afghanistan is like it is goes back centuries. Okay? So that's kind of obvious. But then we're going into places like Afghanistan with our toolkits and our best practice models. There's a problem there in applying the same solutions and the same approaches in these very different contexts. So we have to understand, at the very least, how we adapt our approaches according to the path dependence. And we have to be kind of interested in the path. We have to be interested in history, interested in why it's like it is. And these are big problems, I think, for traditional planning mentality. Alternate staff don't mind me using words like systems or complexity. So I've boiled it down to how do you plan when you don't know what's going to happen? There's people in the aid business who do this all the time. They're humanitarians. They don't know where the next earthquake will be, but they're pretty good at responding when it happens. So what can we learn from humanitarians in terms of long-term developmental advocacy or other aspects of our work? And if you, in Afghanistan, you really can't pretend to know the solution to the problem. And yet campaigners, when I got to Oxfam, I was told there are 3 things you need for a good campaign. You need a problem, a solution, and a villain. Hero is entirely optional, but you need those 3 things. And it's a pretty good model of campaigning. But if you're honest, in many situations, we don't. We can see there's a problem, we can sometimes see there's a villain, but we don't know what the solution is. So that's a real challenge to the conventional thinking about that. Mike Tyson put it all much more succinctly. Somebody pointed out recently, or you get hit in the ear. But this is, you've got your wonderful project, you've spent months and months and months designing it, and it's all ready, you get the money, and then something punches you in the mouth. An event, something goes wrong, something collapses. That's the experience. So can we do better than that? I must explain, all my cultural references come from the early 2000s, because that's when my kids were still teenagers. So there's Harry Potter, there's The Matrix, there's, I think the West Wing's in there. Anyway, this is The Matrix. First Matrix film, don't watch the others, please. The first Matrix film, the hero Neo, who is a kind of thinly disguised Jesus figure, has this moment when he sees the Matrix. He sees all the ones and zeros, kind of, which are underlying the reality. Okay, it's a wonderfully adolescent film. And at that point, he becomes invincible. He becomes this sort of ninja king and can just chop up everybody. And once I started thinking about power, I did not buy myself a very cool long leather coat, but I did start seeing it everywhere. It was a bit like the Matrix. You start seeing power in the room, in this room, in any conversation. You start thinking about, Robert Chambers has this wonderful sort of rule of thumb. In any conversation, just think about who is the upper and who is the lower in this conversation. Really, you just start to be aware of all the different kinds of power. So I think the place to start when thinking about systems is thinking about power, but thinking about power in a different way. So traditionally, when people talk about power, they talk about formal power. They talk about all that stuff about power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think that's complete rubbish. Okay? We need to think in a much more comprehensive way about power. Starting, and this is the only paragraph of Foucault I've ever understood. So I always put it up when I come to university, just to demonstrate I belong here. Starting with the internal nature of power. Yeah. Foucault was brilliant on invisible power, the interiorizing of the gaze, which makes the people like those fishermen in Tikkun think they don't have the right to speak. This is my place in life. I should be grateful for what I get. And that's kind of a form of invisible power which is incredibly important in a lot of change processes. A lot of change processes start with a light bulb moment like this one. These are some Guatemalan women from activists who have had that experience. And I'll let you do the PowerPoint karaoke and just read out the slides. And they've had that moment, and they're now in a position where instead of being downtrodden, they're actually taking on a very scary police force. And I think that's the essence, that's the starting point of many change processes, was that moment of power within. And a colleague of mine, when we talk about Foucault, it's quite oppressive, and you just get the sense that there's this enormous power structure out there which is just going to get you. A colleague of mine, Joe Rowlands, wrote a book on women's empowerment in Honduras, which was a bit more optimistic. And she wrote about that moment of power within, the light bulb moment. And when I started at Oxfam, you go around and people say, my life changed because of that NGO workshop. And you just believe it, because NGO workshops are awful. But if enough people tell you, then you start to believe them. And you start to realize that there are moments of enlightenment which people experience. One, there was an indigenous activist in Bolivia who said, the thing that changed my life was ILO Convention 169. An even weirder conversation. The idea that some guy sitting in the middle of the lowlands of Bolivia had been turned on by an ILO convention. Odd things have this effect on people, but there are these moments of power. When people have one of those light bulb moments, they often look around for people in similar situations and they start to organize. And that's what the guy in Bolivia did, that's what the woman in Guatemala did, and we see that power with all the time. And once you have that power with, then you can start to give out power to influence decisions, influence resource allocation. It's not a linear process, all of them go on all over the time, but it's a useful way to be more nuanced in thinking about power. And power over is when you're actually in a position of control, which is not always a bad thing. So we use this a lot in Oxfam. We use it sort of in big global campaigns, like the campaign to get a global arms trade treaty, which is one of the case studies in the book. But I've used it at village level. This was a visit to Tajikistan, which is anybody here been to Tajikistan or is from Tajikistan? It's a deeply weird place, right? I mean, it's the poorest bit of the Soviet Union, and it has a kind of abandoned feel because it was very reliant, it was like sort of welfare country, and it was the state withdrew and has left an enormous mess. One of the things we're doing there is water and sanitation, and we're trying to get villagers to be more active in solving their problems on water and sanitation because they've just been in this position of massive state dependence on the Soviet Union for decades. So we went around, spent some time in villages, talking to people, and then we came back and sat down with the inevitable flip charts and talked to partners, the local Tajik civil society organisations and now Tajik staff. And I asked them, so who are the stakeholders? Yeah, let's start doing that Afghan now. And they did the classic NGO thing. They said, well, there's the state and there's the people. And that's the kind of mental map in a lot of activists' minds. And so, yes, good. Anybody else? Let's think about the villages you know best. How do people actually influence each other? And then they started to come up with lots of others. They said, oh, well, the teacher's always really prestigious and respected because they're teaching the kids, they're usually better educated. So people often go to the teacher for advice. And the doctor similarly, and the truck driver brings lots of news in from other villages, and actually he sees a bit of a sort of dude in the village. And actually, if you want to get to the mayor, if you know the mayor's lover, that's quite good too, because the lover can only pillow talk works. If you have bad dreams, you go to the imam, and the imam helps you understand why you have that bad dream and what it means. And suddenly, they populated this village in a much more interesting way. They uncovered an ecosystem of relationships, much more like the Afghan map. So then what we did is say, great, okay, so let's write words down in a language I don't know And map them. So if they agree that we need to do something on water and sanitation, but they're not very influential, then let's put it down here. If they're very influential, but they don't agree with us, that's the influence axis. If people are here, then what we're going to do is help them become more influential. Organise, do that linking like the Prime Minister did in India, and get them up to the top right-hand corner. If they're influential but they don't agree with us, well, then convince them. So who would they agree with? Who would they respect? What kind of evidence might persuade them? Do we need to just take them to see some experiences? What's going to work in terms of advocacy? And the more we can get the players up to the top right-hand side, the better chance we've got of getting that change to happen. And we do this, it sounds a bit mechanical, but it's quite a useful mental sort of exercise, and we do it in a lot of different contexts. Okay, so I read this book, and I have, my favourite cartoon. The best cartoon about how people think about change. I wrote a book and I gave it to my two favourite guinea pigs for my sons. We're both activists. And there's one who works for an organisation called Citizens UK, which is one of my favourite UK organisations. And he said, read that, loved it. Unless you can boil it down to 2 slides, there will be of no practical use whatsoever to people like me. And I said, well, I've just written a book explaining that we can't have toolkits, we can't have best practice, and we can't reduce everything to lists and check boxes. He said, it's your decision. Either it has no impact whatsoever, or you boil it down to 2 slides. So he's a good novice, so I will try to boil it down to 2 slides without going to the full, I have the answer, here's the secret of the universe toolkit approach. And this is as far as I got, so we're looking at the power and systems approach. And it focuses on how we behave, how we are, who we are, and the questions we ask. It doesn't say what the answers to those questions should be, and it doesn't say what the activities should be, because that's, I think, contradictory to the whole idea of systems thinking. We need, if you're in that Afghan situation and it's changing constantly, you have to be curious, you have to be a gossip, you have to read the papers, you have to talk to different people, you have to want to, there's a great book called Systems, Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows. She talks about learning to dance with the system. You have to want to dance with the system. And this is not something I see amongst activists. I see a lot of very tired, overworked people in Oxfam who want to know enough to do their next campaign, but who aren't actually fundamentally curious. When you travel around and you talk to Oxfam and other sort of organisations around the world, you notice 2 things. One is it's often the younger staff who are more curious. They're the ones that have had beaten out of them by too many meetings. And also, those conversations happen outside work. It's insane. It's when you go to the bar after the meeting discussing your rock frame or your plan that people actually start talking about the stuff that matters. They start talking about the system and what's changing. So we need to bring that into the day job. Second one is humility. Humility is an overused word. My favourite word is humble bragging. Do you know what humble bragging is? If you follow Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister, you will see what humble bragging is. He tweets things like, humbled to see 500 people waiting to hear me tonight. That's humble bragging. I don't mean humble bragging, I mean actual humility. Evidence-based humility. If you're in that Afghan situation, you're not being humble, you're being honest that you do not know what's going to happen. But that's a real challenge if you're an activist, because activists often, the thing that keeps them going, the thing that makes them go and get in the face of people in power, or older people, or people who have more experience or knowledge, is a kind of brittle self-confidence that they are right, and they know what needs to be done. So to keep the confidence and mix it with humility is a difficult one, but I think it's a really important state of mind that we need to move towards. Partly because that brittle confidence is massively unconvincing to most people. We are not neutral. I think a lot of activists see themselves as essentially invisible. You know, that they don't influence the system, which they're not just by who they are. But actually, we have power. We have power as educated activists, we have power as white people. There was a brilliant piece of research from West Africa where they got some black researchers to interview local people, black people, and ask a series of questions. And then it was a randomized control trial, very, very scientific. In half, they just put a white researcher in the back who said nothing. I just sat there. And they got different answers to when it was just a black person. Right? That is power. That is, and if you're a white researcher, you need to know that piece of research, and you need to think about your influence on the system you're trying to investigate. So being more conscious of our own power and prejudices. Multiple perspectives. So very rare that Oxfam never do anything on its own. It does it in lots of coalitions and alliances. And I started to notice some things about these coalitions and alliances. If you're in a coalition where everybody more or less thinks like you, and the problem is very broadly stated, you're probably going to waste your time. So I've spent entire nights negotiating a communique with 100 NGOs in Bangkok. And that communique had absolutely no influence on the world at all. But we managed to find huge things to disagree and fight about, because that's what NGOs do. A more recent example, I would say, is the Sustainable Development Goals, which I think were a massive waste of time, but if you're in a situation where there's lots of awkward allies in the room, people you don't quite like, people who dress differently from you, think differently from you know, religious leaders, private sector, captains of industry, banks, academics, and NGOs, and the problem is narrowly defined, then I think we're much more likely to get somewhere interesting. And we're doing more and more of these things where we see a lot of activists as being kind of convener, a broker and a catalyst of getting these different people in the room, keeping them there, and seeing what happens. And I think this is kind of a new direction we're going. The questions we ask, and where do we look? The sort of meat and drink of activism is policy. We love changing policies. There's loads of Oxfam people at the Tory Party conferences, weekly fringe meetings, trying to influence policy and spending. That's the kind of nuts and bolts. But far less on actually whether any of that is implemented. You know, huge gaps on implementation. Uganda at one point was, I think, top of the entire table for its transparency and anti-corruption legislation, and somewhere about 100th in terms of what actually is going on. So huge gaps, which we're not looking at. But then even more important, at least, the norms question. So this is, I think, a sign of advancing years, but looking back, I think some of the biggest impacts that activists have had are not on policies or even practices, but on how people see themselves and each other. Huge changes in issues like how men see women, how adults see children, how straight people see gay people, how able-bodied people see disabled people, and how disabled people see themselves, how women see themselves, how indigenous people see themselves. And there's some interesting research, nowhere near enough, on when does that happen and why. But that seems to be a huge area where we need to ask many more questions than we think about. Precedents. So, one of the things which annoys me about environmentalists, there are several, one of them is a tendency towards what I call, if I ruled the world, advocacy. Right? So I've got this great idea for a carbon trading scheme, why doesn't everybody do it? That's considered to be a campaign. It's not a campaign, it's a form of therapy. Thinking that you can make up something which is going to solve everything is a very shallow form of advocacy. And actually, I think a lot of the time we're much better off looking at what's worked on this issue in history or what's working right now. And weirdly, people do that very readily. Oxfam, just in case you think I'm just anti-environmentalist, Oxfam has an enormous campaign on inequality. Right? We get loads of big press coverage, we do these big numbers in Davos of 65 people have the same wealth as the 3.5 billion poorest people. But no one in Oxfam has noticed that 23 countries in the last 50 years have actually reduced inequality over a 10-year period. And now academics have noticed and done a comparative study of why that is. Why those 23 countries decide to actually tackle inequality. Because history is kind of systematically wiped out in the way we think. In terms of what's happening right now, on all these issues, whether it's malnutrition, female genital mutilation, women's rights, the distribution is never a single spike. There's always a distribution with positive outliers. And one of the really extraordinary things is how little people go and look at the positive outliers to see what's already working in the system. And when people do this, it's an approach called positive deviance. It's really, really interesting, and you can get some fantastic results from doing that, but it doesn't fit into the project framework, so people don't do it. There's one example, a brilliant book called the Positive Deviance Approach. People asked these two positive deviance specialists to go and look at human genital mutilation in Egypt. 97% of women have been cut in Egypt. So the positive deviance people said, 3%, let's go look at that. They asked local activists, do you think those 3% of women would self-identify and speak on camera? And the local activists said, absolutely no way, they were terrified. They were only too happy to talk about this. So the positive deviance people want to talk to the families and talk to the women concerned, and they built a whole campaign around what is it that meant that that 3% did something different and did something better. And that's worked in superbugs in American hospitals, really interesting. Not on the map at the moment. The power I talked about, and then the final point I want to make was, let's assume that whatever we come up with, however many books we read, is not the best, and maybe we'll be totally wrong in terms of our campaign, our program, our project. Have we got systems in place that we notice quickly, and that when we notice, we do something about it? It's a bit like if I was riding my bike across Portsmouth, and I decided to do it like a good aid worker, I would design a log frame which would set out in advance all my movements and speeds and changes of direction, and I would then just execute the plan. And I would die very quickly. Okay? Because the essence of riding a bicycle, and I ride a bicycle in London, so trust me, I know this, is fast feedback and responding quickly to events, okay, including mad drivers. So, what's the equivalent? Do we have a system in place where people can notice and people can change direction? We often don't. It often takes a very long time for people to notice, and then there's no clear way of saying, hold on a minute, time out, this isn't working, what do we need to change? Okay, I'm going to stop there, because that's about my time up. I think you just said just do Q&A comments or whatever, yeah? So let's go to that now. Thanks. Who wants to say anything? Speak. You can make a comment, you don't have to pretend it's a question. Non-rules do not apply.
You mentioned why the Sustainable Development Goals are massive.
Okay, so I have to sort of 30-second rant or 30-minute rant. So, okay, so the question was, why did I think the Sustainable Development Goals were a waste of time? I was involved right from the beginning. So it's sort of about 2011, the first conversations were, what do we do when the Millennium Development Goals finish in 2050? And the conversation was dominated by people in and around the United Nations. Because the United Nations had used the MDGs to argue for more aid and to get better data collection so that we know whether we're achieving the Millennium Development Goals. But the problem was that aid is becoming less and less important in more and more countries. So whatever came after the MDGs could not just be a kind of rerun. It needed to think about what international instruments change the way national governments behave. Because in the end, it's national governments that are going to make spending decisions, that are going to change laws, that are going to change practices, that are going to make policy history. And what struck me from the beginning was that no one ever asked that question of the MDGs. There was no research until fairly recently about what international instruments actually influence government decision making. Okay, you go to governments and you say, have the MDGs made you spend more on education? They go, yeah. They want the aid. They want the aid. But to actually do a rigorous piece of research to say, was it the UN Declaration of Human Rights? Was it regional commitments? Was it rivalry with your local NGO? Was it India's rivalry with Bangladesh that made its change in spending? No one has done that research because no one is actually interested in influencing national government behaviour. So I was very shocked because there are bits of research and it's quite interesting. So one example, if you want to use something like the Sustainable Development Goals, this enormous number of goals and targets to influence national governments, you should probably publish a league table fairly regularly on a regional basis so that India is regularly shamed about how much better Bangladesh is doing. But there's no reason why that should happen. It might just be Jeffrey Sachs banging on in New York every 2 years. So they haven't decided to have impact. So that was my point. Yeah.
I'm curious, I think this about business model,
We don't have a roving mic, so I'll repeat the question as far as I can. I'll summarize it. Okay. So how I understood that was, yeah, there are psychological questions here. Some people like disruption and unpredictability and change. Some people massively resist it. And how does that personal psychological dimension play into all this? And I think that's a really interesting question, and it's a question that I have not done enough about at this point. My wife is a psychotherapist, so we talk about this quite a lot. And in the aid and development business, the kind of thinking stops here at the time. And yeah, Joe's thing about power within is seen as massively insightful, but from a sort of psychological point of view, it's incredibly crude. Actually, why do people achieve power within? What is power? How's power experienced? How's well-being experienced? Why do some people like change and some people hate it? All those questions. Yeah, absolutely. All those things not on the agenda. The World Bank sort of tweaked at it in the most recent World Development Report, but it all went down the sort of nudge route of behavioural economics. So I think if you can crack that one, do come back to me. Yes.
When funding is so frequently attached to projects and campaigns, how do you begin to evolve to looking more broadly at systems?
So this is a question about funding tends to be channeled through projects with a very systematized way of predicting, measuring, reporting back. So how on earth do you go with this with that system in place? There's enough people at senior level in the funders who get it. My blog today is about a really interesting meeting with a guy from the USAID. It's quite influential in their global learning lab. And in conversation over a beer, just let slip that he once lived in a cave for 6 months and done the washing up for the Dalai Lama. So these are not traditional civil servants. And people at the top get the Afghan problem, they understand this, and there's some really interesting top-down exercises in DFID, the USAID, and the World Bank trying to address this. The latest slogan is adaptive management. I think there's a much bigger problem if you're funded, which is that you don't get to talk to those people very much. You tend to talk to the people who are not DFID. There was a certain group of people who I thought of as the dandruff people. There were people who they work 9 to 5 on a good day. It was just a job. They wanted an easy life, and they headed for the bar. They had its own bar in those days. It was good times. They headed for the bar at 5 o'clock. They did not want all this complexity stuff. They want to do the KPIs. And then the numbers. Well, that's a great advocacy problem. So you've got a divided institution with leadership on your side, sticky middle being unhelpful. Yeah, that's easy. You know what to do. You find the champions, you find the examples of good practice, you make a hell of a stink when people try and stop you, and you actually move things along. A lot of the problems are actually in our heads. So one private example, in Tanzania, DFID came to us through the evil management consultants KPMG, and KPMG was managing an accountability grant for them, and said, everything's boring here, have $1 million to try something different. I paraphrase, but that's what we said. And we said, great, we'll do that. And then the Oxfam computer said no. The Oxfam computer said, I cannot accept, or we will not take this money unless there are KPIs, key performance indicators, unless there's a timetable, predicted outputs, outcomes, blah, blah, blah. It took us months to actually accept the check and do it. So don't tell me that the donors are inflexible and rigid and that's what's stopping us. It's our own systems too. So I think there's a real chance to make alliances within the donors around this stuff. And there's a lot of very interesting donor-led and academic-led and coalition discussions going on around. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, there's one coalition who are doing development differently, based at Harvard. There's one who are thinking and working politically, based in various places. But these are in adaptive management. These are all interesting and going in the right direction. We'll see whether they can actually subvert the project. Yeah.
How would you factor in the almost hidden power of corporations that influence people's values, that both of the good technological fits, agriculture, for example, there must be, and they're factoring in power.
Yeah. So it sounds wonderfully divided between the anti-corporate and the, I get very excited when I'm in a room with corporates communities. I'm in the latter. I think, I had a meeting with Paul Holman, the CEO of Unilever, and he is an archetype of bullshit, he really is. He just, I got the tape, and it was a 70-minute meeting, and I didn't get a word, but he was extraordinary. It was like, I don't know what it was on, but I want something, it was calm. But he just says things like, well, we're trying to get 500,000 poor women into supply chains. That's our target. And so on that thing, I'm thinking, well, we will never get anywhere near that scale. So if it's genuine, and it seems to be the case of Unilever, then there's something worth pursuing. On the other hand, there are clearly some extraordinarily bad corporate practices going on. And organisations like Global Witness do a fantastic job in exposing them, and we do a bit of that ourselves, things like land grabs. So I think, again, it's, corporations aren't a single thing. It's understanding how change happens within those corporations, and then finding balance. So one example, I was on the board of something called the Ethical Trading Initiative, which was supermarkets and garment manufacturers, trade unions and NGOs trying to sort out labour rights in their supply chains. And the guy from Sainsbury's comes up to me after a meeting and says, Duncan, could the NGOs campaign against Sainsbury's a bit more, please? It's interesting. Why? He said, well, the board's thinking of cutting my budget. And it would be very helpful if there was some stuff in the newspapers. So there's a situation where you can work with that. Whenever there's whenever you get to know a system, if it's pharmaceutical companies, even probably gene tech, although that's a pretty toxic issue to touch, you can find allies and you can do leaders and laggards, we call it. You work with the leaders, you put pressure on the laggards, and eventually that will lead to some pressure for legislation. That's the other false thing people say about regulations, is the voluntary approach is the alternative to legislation. As soon as some leader companies start doing things, and then they see, to pick a company like that, and Tesco's not doing it, they will start saying, well, that's not fair. Government should step in. So it's quite interesting the dynamics you get going in some of these processes. You're very unconvinced. Come back to me afterwards. Yeah. So the question there is that extraordinary factory collapse which killed 1,100 people in Bangladesh, Rana Plaza, about 3 years ago, I think, and whether if we're in bed with the garment companies who are making stuff in Rana Plaza, that makes it impossible for us to act.
Well, does it take that earthquake to make change happen? Can you make change happen without that?
Okay. So I would say both. And I did a study on Rana Plaza because it's such an interesting thing. So within a month of that factory disaster, the Bangladeshi garment industry and government had approved a new fire safety accord. And the reason was, in no small part, because the people who've been working together, the companies and NGOs and unions, have been working together for years, knew each other, trusted each other, and as soon as they saw the news, they were on the phone and said, we've got to do something. So in that sense, it was an example where prior relationships actually allow you to respond quickly to a critical juncture. And I think there's some extraordinary quotes from Milton Friedman, other people, about the role of economists is to build up the evidence base, and I would say relationships, so that when something happens, you're in there. And I think Rana Plaza was actually quite a good example. And the first couple of the companies, because they knew this was not going to be good, and they actually didn't. They weren't happy, they were upset. But they're humans as well. So there's a final sort of anecdote. When I was at this thing on board this thing called Epic Grade Industry, I was younger and more naive, and I was trying to recruit one of the big department stores in London. And I had my suit and tie on, and I was really going for it. I was talking about staff retention and reputation risk, and getting a competitive edge over the rivals. And at the end of it, the guy I was trying to recruit said, sorry lad, I just want to make the world better for my children. And I just felt really stupid because I'd just seen somebody who wasn't human, who was just a corporate there, and not realised what actually motivated him. And that was a kind of lesson in terms of finding people and connecting with them in unlikely situations. I mean, I was an extraordinarily naive liberal.
Taking process. So can you really change with the rural-based projects, rural-led projects?
Rural-led
projects. Which are rural-led projects. A donor company, says, have a project in Pakistan, already here. Outside starts it after a year, and they have no funding in this topic. So will this bring change something?
I think you have an answer to that question. So the question is, can a donor-led project or a donor come in with something like, we're going to do a project to aid honor killings in Pakistan, and get some NGOs to come in and run a project. When they leave, will there be anything different? And I'd say the answer is probably not. So some responses to that, what you leave is crucial. And in our case, it would have to be local organisations who are committed to this, who are committed at the beginning, don't brainwash them. And if the project helps them become more effective, then great. And it's got to work. There's a really good book called Working with the Grain. It's got to be with, you have a sort of difficult balancing act of being with the grain of society, but not with the grain of the bad guys. So you're bringing in new ideas, you're trying to change things, but you have to be aware of the system and what works. So an example from West Africa. Oops, I'll just give you an example from West Africa. There was a problem on education in West Africa, which is that Francophone West Africa had lots of very nice French secular schools, and the people of West Africa, many of them are devout Muslims, and they were sending their kids to the madrasas. And the madrasas had useless education systems. So some countries tried to shut down the madrasas and say you have to send your kids to a secular school, a bit like the sort of Burkini fiasco in France at the moment, kind of rampant secularism. Other countries said, whatever, send them to madrasas. Some places said, well, we'll allow the madrasas as long as they adopt certain minimum standards. And they actually did a hybrid. It's called a hybrid institution. And when you get that kind of hybridity between what's there already and what works from outside, that's when things start to improve. So I think it's thinking in those terms of working with the brain is better than thinking I have this great external answer and I'm going to find it. Sorry, I talked too long, which means you can't talk enough. That's how happen.
Thank you very much.
trying to sell you the book that isn't there.